Hey there, I'm Nicholas. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. So many people have commented and messaged me and asked me about my editing process and how do I make my pictures look the way they do, that I've finally decided to start a YouTube channel and reveal all my secrets, I guess. People have said that my pictures are moody, that they're painterly, that they look like paintings, or that they bring a sense of calm or peace. And I've actually had people paint my photos, which is amazing. But how do I achieve that effect? The most important thing to achieve this look is that lighting conditions matter a lot. If you're shooting in harsh sunlight in the middle of the day, it's not going to achieve the same result that you will shooting in more overcast or sunset type environments. For my specific style, I find that more overcast days are what I get the best images out of. So not exactly sunsets or bright, happy, shining things. It's mostly actually cloudy or overcast days to achieve this kind of more moody, painterly look. The second thing to achieve this look, and it's more or less optional, is having a bloom filter. Bloom filters are helpful because, and here's this one here from Moment that was sent to me. This is the 10% diffusion. It creates halation around bright light sources. So for example, if you look at this light in the back here, see how it's got like this soft glow around it. So any lights, if you're exposed properly, it'll pop up like that, and it's quite nice to achieve this kind of, it's more of a film look, but painterly as well. I think it helps achieve that because you're adding some haze into it, some diffusion, some softness. It also helps create softness across the entire image. For example, if you look at my face right now, and actually I can just take off the filter. See, now it's much more sharp on my facial features, and honestly I don't really like it that much. I like the softness of the bloom filter. So with that, let's jump right into the editing process. We're starting out with a pretty boring image here, I would say. It's also kind of underexposed because I was exposing for the highlights here. And as you can see already, you can see some of that softness from the halation from the bloom filter there. You wouldn't get that without the filter. So definitely recommend that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and crop the image. And usually I would put the subject on a third. I kind of want a little bit lower actually. Let's see how that looks. Yeah. And then let's just do the basic settings here. So bring in exposure, a little bit of contrast. I'm going to bring the highlights down some, not completely, and then I'm going to bring the shadows up. And from there, a lot of people, what they do is they actually bring down the whites, but I actually like to bring up the whites, and then drag the blacks down and to give it a little bit more contrast there. I think temperature wise is pretty good. We can try to set the white balance and see what happens. I don't really see anything that's white, and it may be there. Nope, not that. So I don't know, I may want something a bit more blue, but we'll play around with it. Probably one of the most important things to achieve this effect is to decrease texture and decrease clarity. And what I've seen a lot of beginner photographers do is they see these sliders here and they just go, oh, let's increase the clarity, let's increase the texture. Makes a super sharp image, right? But actually no, you want softness. Softness is what you're trying to achieve. So you're actually going to bring these down quite a substantial amount. I would not go past like 25% though, because it starts to look, you can tell that you're bringing down the clarity if you do more than that, and I don't like it. Since I also have the bloom filter, I can not drag this down as much. If I didn't have the filter on, I would probably drop it to -25, but I'm probably gonna do -15 here. I think that looks pretty good. I also, same thing, dehaze. I'll usually drop this down a good bit if I'm not using the bloom filter, but since I have the bloom filter on, I will only drop it down a bit and then maybe even leave it at 0 actually, because I think it looks fine. So from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the vibrance up just a little bit and the saturation up just a little bit. And then sometimes I'll actually bring the vibrance down, and that you can see already makes kind of a deeper green here. But we're going to play with the greens more with in the HSL sliders here, so that's not a big issue. Then I've actually, so on yours you'll probably see that the calibration is down at the bottom, but I actually moved the calibration up to here for myself because I find that super helpful, because this is probably the first thing after the basic exposure settings that I play around with, because it actually changes your image and what it looks like substantially, so it's very important. So what I usually do is I go blues and reds over to here, and then greens to balance it, and then I'll drop the saturation down of these two, and then actually bring the saturation of this up. And I'm going to dial back the blue quite a bit because I actually don't like how that's looking, and maybe bring the greens back a bit. This is one that it will vary wildly per image, so you're just going to have to play around with it a bit and see how it looks. But this is kind of a standard setup for me for the calibration here. All right, so let's dive into curves. Curves are also very important for achieving this effect. What I'm going to do is start with a basic S curve here, and then I bring this down to the point where it's creating contrast but not clipping anything. Like you see, that's obviously way too much already. So I'm going to bring it back, and you can already see that this kind of, it's already creating a lot of good contrast here. And what I'm going to do is actually, and this is the signature kind of style of this effect, so I'm going to bring the blacks up quite a bit. You can see that it's now, the blacks are no longer black, but then I'm also going to create another point in between here, and then I'm going to drag this back down to the middle line. I'm not sure if you can see that, but like the diagonal line that states that this is where it was standard. Now I might actually mess with this a little bit more, and I'm actually going to go back and bring up the exposure a bit, highlights down, shadows I think are fine, maybe up a bit as well. And then, yeah, so it's kind of a back and forth constantly to make this work, as you'll play around with it and see what happens. So I'm going to bring the highlights up a little bit, and I'm going to bring the whites down to clip the whites. I'm not sure this is going to do anything in this image. Oh, there is some, you can see here there's some blown out whites, I think, so it'll change those a bit. But I always simply bring this down so there's no like blinding white images or blinding white sections, and then maybe create a bit more contrast. So now with the HSL, this is probably, it's a finicky one to get used to, but one of the most powerful tools, and that's messing around with the oranges and the greens and whatnot. Blues, there's not really any blues in this image, so it doesn't really matter, but usually I pointed a bit towards aqua. Greens are the most finicky though, by far. They're very difficult to get right. I guess that's subjective, but I personally found it very difficult to get greens right for a very long time, because they end up looking like too yellowish or too tropical or something like that. But I want like this deep, rich green as like this forest is conveying here. So let's drag the yellows over to about 50%, and then I'm going to drag the greens over, and that's obviously way too much. Let's drop down the oranges a little bit. But what's going to make this look really good is actually dropping the saturation of the yellows, and then also the saturation of the greens. So now we see we have this, it's not quite pastel colors, but it's quite, it's not rich. It's not overdoing it. It's actually bringing it down to allow more of the subject to pop. And then, like I said, there aren't any blues in this, so I'm gonna drop these down a little bit. If there's a lot of blues, usually I'll desaturate them a good bit so it doesn't compete with the rest of the image or the subject, or if there's green in there. So not much to do here. Let's bring this up and bring the yellows up just a bit. Bring the greens up, or let's see. Yeah, just bring them up a bit. It's not. And you can see this is kind of standard. I usually desaturate most things. I don't use any reds, but then most of them I don't touch that much. So if you want to see what you're affecting in a shot with your HSL sliders, what you can do is hold Alt and then drag one of the sliders, and it'll show you exactly what color you're changing. So you can see I'm changing the oranges there. Might bring that down a good bit actually. Let's look at the yellows. You can see I'm affecting kind of the more yellowish colors of the greens, and then not the actual greens itself, which are controlled by this. So let's do that there actually. actually want to bring this down some more. And then, so the same effect happens here with sharpening, where if you hold Alt and then do the mask, you can control where you're, exactly what you're sharpening the most. So it kind of makes like a depth map or something like this, I guess. So, or I guess a luminance map. So I really want to only do this to my subject and some of the highlights, so that's what does that there. And subtle, but I think it looks nice. And then I always add a bit of grain to my images to give it more of that film effect. And I usually do about 25. Sometimes I'll do 50 if I'm feeling crazy, but I think 25 is fine for most images. It's not too much, not too little either, so you don't miss it. It's still there. I'm not sure if you can see that, but there is a bit of grain, just a little bit. So now I'm going to go back to my curves actually, and you notice I didn't do the RGB curves yet, so I'm going to go back here and I'll create a nice S curve with these. Not too much, just a little bit. That adds a little bit of contrast in each color, because as you can see, if I do too much, it starts to look way, way too much. So let's add a bit of blue in the shadows there. And if I feel like it isn't balancing it quite enough in the highlights, what I'll do is I'll go in and then create another point here and then drag it down. But I actually don't like how the yellows look in the highlights there. I kind of want to keep it blue. I don't want magenta in the highlights. I also don't want cyan. Maybe a bit of cyan, but nah, I don't think that looks very good. So we've finished basically all of the regular settings, and I might go back and play with some vibrance here. Let's bring it up just a bit. I can also bring a bit of warmth up here. You can already see that changes pretty substantially. That makes a boring photo pretty interesting, actually, I would say. So now let's get to masking, which is another one of the most important factors of creating this effect. So let's go to radial gradient, and that's usually the first thing I do is I add a radial gradient to kind of isolate the subject, and then if you press the quotations button, it'll actually switch back and forth between what the mask is selecting, inverted or not inverted. And then I'm going to drop this down just a little bit, not too much. You can see it's already kind of isolating the subject a bit. It's got a really nice feather on it, and then I'm going to create a linear gradient. I'm going to drag this up from the bottom. So almost everything I'm doing in my images is looking to create contrast across several factors. So I'm creating color contrast, I'm creating darkness contrast, or exposure contrast, sorry. And then I'm also going to create masking contrast, which I guess is also kind of just exposure. But to me, it's a bit separate, because what I'm going to do is going to bring down the exposure a bit here. You can already see that that kind of isolates the subject a good bit. I may actually bring up the exposure a bit more so that it's about right. And then darken this. Don't have to overdo it, but it's already doing a good job of isolating the subject. As you can see, that's just a bunch of foreground that's not really necessary to serve the image. So then that brings it up. Make sure you have a nice gradient here as well. And then let's add a subject. Kind of got it. I might just select an object though. Close enough. Select the person. Let's increase the texture and the clarity then just a little bit, and this will kind of make, so basically I'm just bringing it back to, I think I had -15 and -14. So I'm basically just bringing this back to normal so that the subject is still pretty clear and not as soft as the background. You could do this the inverse way by selecting the background, but I usually just like to isolate the subject. So the last basic mask I'm going to add is another linear gradient, and this completes the contrast effect that I was talking about earlier, where I'm going to take a linear mask and pull it from the direction of the sun or your light source, and then I'm going to increase the exposure. I'm going to increase a little bit of the temperature to make it warmer. And then I'm going to decrease the dehaze, so make it more hazy, and then decrease the clarity. And so this gives it kind of a dreamy glow-like effect. This is also kind of mimicking what the bloom filter is doing. However, it's just exaggerating it, I guess. And if I didn't have the bloom filter on it, I would probably be adding a lot more of this to make it softer. But I find that this then creates a lot of contrast in the image, and then also brings your eye towards the subject. And I might actually make this entire thing darker so that it enhances the effect more. Let's see. Maybe a bit warmer as well. And then bring this up some more. So I don't know, it just really gives it, it makes it pop. It really gives it some image contrast throughout the entire thing. Instead of making it very flat, it makes it very rich and lifelike, I guess. So I'll turn off the masks here, and you can see without the masks, it feels very flat, and with the masks, it actually does a nice job of creating that contrast like I mentioned previously. So I believe that's pretty much everything. Everything else is up to pretty much personal choice. Sometimes I'll go in and I'll add a transform, and I'll make like buildings or something like that upright. Otherwise I'll just play around with colors and play around with things until I get kind of the style that I like. And just remember that this little lift in the blacks right here is very important for making this effect. Second, the decreasing the texture and clarity is very important for this, and also dehaze if you're not using a bloom filter. A bit of contrast to kind of counteract that, and then also the third thing is the contrast with the linear masks here. Well, that pretty much wraps it up, so thank you guys for watching. Now remember, if you don't want to go through the whole process of editing this yourself, I do have presets available that you can check at the link in the description. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.